Welcome to today's episode of the Vineyard Underground podcast. This is your host and viticulturist, Fritz Westover. And in both my consulting work and with my online virtual viticulture academy, I work with a lot of new growers. They're planting and establishing their vineyards. And the first 3 years of vine growth can really make or break your vineyard, both in how quickly you can generate positive cash flow and for the long-term production and longevity of your vines. And I like to talk about longevity of vines, and that starts early in the vine training process. So today, I want to take some time to talk to you about young vine training and specifically scenarios where young vine training may differ due to your growing climate and your goals. It's just going to be me today, me and you, here as I talk through some of the most important points of young vine training. So stick around with me here, and whether you're working in your vineyard or whatever you're doing, I'm going to keep you some company too. So whether you have a young vineyard or you've added additional acres of new vines, or you just need some help training replants, this episode will help you grow and train your young vines in the best way for your specific vineyard scenario. That's my goal. Or at the very least, it's going to give you some insights to compare to how you have trained young vines in the past. As we start this conversation about how climate influences young vine training, I want to mention a few things related to trellis choices. Your choice of trellis obviously will impact how you train your vines. You're most likely going to be on a lower or a higher fruiting wire or fruit zone, depending on your grape variety, your climate, and how you plan to manage the vineyard. For example, mechanization of vineyards usually calls for either a vertical shoot position training system. That's typically a mid-height fruiting wire, waist height, if you will, or lower or higher than that, or a single high wire, which a mechanical harvester can go around and is just less trellis and hardware in the way. But we obviously have a lot of other training systems out there. And the way we're going to talk about training vines today is pretty much going to apply to all of those scenarios. The difference is if you have a higher training system or a higher fruiting zone, you're just going to have a taller trunk, but the way you're going to get there is going to be pretty much the same. I like to talk about terminology differences of things like trellis versus training system. So when we talk about how vines are trellised, what we're specifically talking about there is the physical hardware and the post and the wires and the cross arms and the height and specific width of all of those dimensions that we put together to build the physical trellis, which is what supports our grapevines. But the term we use for how we train the vines and the training system is just that. It's a training system. So there's a trellis. It's not a trellis system. Maybe some would call it that. It's the trellis that is designed for a specific training system. So in general, training systems like the single high wire or the divided or quad systems like the Geneva double curtain are used for specific objectives. Another variation in young vine training that I want to talk about today that is most commonly found in cold climate vineyards is referred to as spare parts viticulture. And I remember the first time I heard this term, I was very intrigued by it, and it just sounds like something I wanted to unpack immediately. Spare parts viticulture can also be referred to spare parts vine training because this practice is more common when growers are working with vinifera or any grape variety that's only marginally cold hardy enough to be successfully grown in a specific region, or if you every 1 in 5 to 10 years have severe cold events that can take out trunks, and we need to therefore be always thinking about where the new trunk or new cordons or new parts are going to come from. So what does spare parts viticulture or vine training mean? This means leaving spare parts when both pruning and when you're shoot thinning on young vines, and sometimes even leaving 2 or 3 trunks on young vines as a way to get a little bit of diversity in vine size and selection for your final trunk, and picking the right size wood. Because of course, you'll always hear me say we don't want to pick very small wood, or what I say is wimpy wood, for developing permanent vine structures like trunks. So anything less than 8 to 10 millimeters in diameter, or less than 3/8 of an inch in diameter, might be borderline for that thickness that is desirable. And this is going to be the same for cordons or any other permanent vine structure. So by leaving multiple options for trunks, when we're dormant pruning, that allows us to pick the 1 or 2 best sized, best shaped, best internode lengths between bud positions for our future trunk. And with respect to young vine training, there's a theme around leaving multiple growth points or branching points from very low on the vines, whether they're grafted or non-grafted. Okay, in our final segment today for young vine training variation, I want to talk about the difference for training young vines if you have very high vigor rootstocks or soil, or very low vigor rootstocks and soil. So we'll start with the high vigor scenario because this is one I run into a lot, especially in the eastern United States where we have heavy rainfall during the season and oftentimes very high organic matter soils. So for high vigor young vine training situations, one of the biggest challenges we find is the production of shoots that grow too quickly and produce what we call a bull cane. And if you've heard the term bull cane before, I'm just going to define loosely what that means using my terminology, which is basically a very rapid growing shoot that has very long spacing between nodes. So the internode spacing is going to be 8 to maybe 12 inches in length in these vines, whereas it's normally going to be somewhere from 3 to 4 inches if I'm using inches as the parameter here. And the canes are also going to, instead of growing round, they're going to be more oblong or oval in their cross section. And sometimes the buds flatten out and seem a little bit insignificant compared to buds on rounder wood. And those bull canes, because they're growing rapidly, are oftentimes cited as being less cold hardy and having less consistent bud bursts. So if you're using them to form a trunk or layover to form a cordon, if every other bud does not push, that means you have very large gaps in between your spur positions. So we just don't get the vine parts that we need for proper selection for vine training. So the way to avoid bull canes is to, number one, best match your rootstock and your variety to your soil and the annual rainfall you have. So a lot of times when we have heavy rainfall areas, I'll use Virginia or Maryland or even Pennsylvania as examples here. In the eastern United States, we'll oftentimes use low vigor rootstocks, especially on our highest vigor varieties. So we know varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot, or even Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc can be very high vigor in general. So we tend to want to put those on lower vigor rootstocks that match the soil in those regions in terms of soil pH and other characteristics. But those examples would be things like Riparia, Gloire, or 10114, or in some cases 420A, in general, lower vigor rootstocks. And if it's a more moderately growing grape variety, it could be put on a more moderate growing rootstock. In the case of the eastern United States, on a acidic soil, this might be 3309C or 1616C, for example. Whereas when we get into dry climates where irrigation is really supplying all of the water, there's still things that can overproduce or produce large bull canes. And those factors would include overwatering, if you're watering too frequently or in too high a volume, over-fertilizing, if you're applying too much fertilizer in the first year. I'm a strong believer that fertilization is necessary in many cases for getting young vines to develop properly, especially when they have small root systems. But if the soil is very high vigor and has very good nutritional content, we may not need to add any at all. But we certainly don't want to be the cause of bull cane production by adding too much fertilizer. And there may be also the incorrect choice or decision making when doing your young vine training. In other words, if it's a high vigor site and you're coming into year 2, you wouldn't want to use the fast track strategy to go down to one shoot on year 2, because in year 2 you have a much bigger root system that's been developed, and that means you're going to have a lot more vigor potential to push your shoot growth. So you're probably going to keep 2 or even sometimes 3 shoots in year 2 or 3 when you're trying to produce that trunk. So there are several things from watering to your climate considerations to fertilization considerations, and then how you actually make decisions in how you're training your vines and how much vegetative growth you're allowing in a given year. Now let's talk about low vigor situations. There are some cases where water availability is just not there, or if you're in a dry farm vineyard and you have low rainfall, low absorption of nutrients into the vine, we may actually come up with a trunk or a shoot that reaches the height that we want for the trunk, but that wood is just too small. So it's much less than 8 millimeters in diameter. It's much less than 3/8 of an inch or even less than a pencil diameter. And in that case, we want to make sure we make the hard decision to cut our vines back down to the ground to a 2-bud spur during our dormant pruning season, because we don't want to allow that wimpy wood to try to size up, because the reality is it just doesn't size up. We need to start with that good size wood from very early on in the process.